interesting book from my father's library, The Book of Myths, written by Amy Cruz. There are illustrations in half-tone and black and white. It was written in Toronto, Clark, Irwin and Company Limited. And then you have London, George C. Harrap and Company Limited. It's written as Copyright Canada. It shows printed in Canada, Copyright Canada 1942 by Clark, Irwin and Company Limited. And there it's been reprinted. The book has been reprinted, and since this is a very old book, the last reprinted was March 1958. So looking at the contents, we see chapter 1 is Myths of the Greeks and the Romans. The second chapter is on Myths of the Norsemen. Third is a chapter on Myths of the North American Indians. Fourth chapter has Myths of Mexico and Peru. Fifth is Myths of the Egyptians. Sixth, Myths of the Babylonians. Seventh is Myths of the Hindus. Eighth is Myths of the Japanese. Ninth is Myths of the Chinese. And 10th is the Myths of the Australians. And then of course you have the pronouncing list of names. Very interesting. I'm not going to read out stories. You must get this book to read it. But I'll just read about what is there in this book that Amy has written to the reader as AC. Okay, to the reader. You can remember a time not so very long ago when this world was quite new and strange to you, and when everything you saw, the sun and moon and stars, the winds and the rain, the buds that came on the trees in springtime, the flowers growing up from seed in your garden seemed to you so wonderful that you felt you must know how it all came to pass. You were constantly asking questions of anyone you thought might be able to explain these mysteries to you. Where does the sun go to in the night time? How many stars are there, and what are they made of? What makes the wind blow? How does a plant come out of a tiny seed? These and 100 others you asked many times, and the answers you received never quite satisfied you. You were given reasons which seemed to you just as difficult to understand as a thing that had puzzled you, and much less interesting, or you were perhaps told to wait until you were older and you would learn all you wanted to know at school. Now you're older and have begun to understand very little about the wonderful laws that govern the universe and give a place to each of the myriad stars and a time for the appearance of each tiny herb of the field. Yet the world has not grown less wonderful, but whereas once you saw only the great and obvious marvels, you are now gradually becoming aware that everything, the stone by the wayside, scarcely less than the great sun itself, has a story which is as interesting and exciting as any fairy tale that was ever written. When you read the myths and legends that are set down in this book, remember how you felt before you knew that science had some sort of explanation to give of the things that puzzled and delighted you. And remember that in the early days of a nation's history, the people, even when they were grown men and women, felt in this respect just as you felt when you were a very little child. In those days, the first lesson of science had not been learnt. No one had any idea that there was a means of finding out the laws that govern the universe, or indeed that there were any laws at all. There was no one of whom a man could ask questions, for no one knew any more than he knew himself. He saw the marvels, and he could not rest without some explanation of them. So he made an explanation and answered his own questions. If you think for a little You will, I'm sure, be able to guess the kind of explanation that he made. You will remember how very apt children are to think of the objects around them as if they were persons, how they will talk of the unkind stone that hurt them when they fell, and the dear little star that is looking at them from the sky. The men who lived in the early stages of the world's history had just this childlike way of looking at things. It seemed to them natural to believe that the sun, which they saw every day traveling across the sky in glory, marked the passage of a great and splendid sovereign, that the thunder was the voice of an angry deity, and the earth lay cold and dead in winter because a stern and terrible being had bound it in kindlier God, in iron chains, and that between this being and the milder, kindlier God who brought the grass out and flowers and trees upon the earth, a continual conflict was going on in which first one and then the other was victorious, and so on. Through all the works of nature, for them the world was peopled not only by the men and women they could see, but by a vast crowd of higher beings who did not make themselves visible, but the signs of whose presence could be perceived on the land and on the water, in the air and in the sky. From such a beginning, it is believed, all the mythologies of the world have been built up. It is easy to see how, as time went on, they would grow and develop. Names given to these gods, and they were decided according to the picture which naturally rose between the eyes of those who worshipped them. A home was imagined for them, full of such glory and splendor as befitted its great inhabitants. The more important gods were enthroned as rulers over the others, and relationships between them, such as husband and wife, father and son, were established. As the world grew older, legend was added to myth. Each nation had its heroes whose great deeds were sung by the minstrels, and these songs were handed on from one generation to the next. The stories, like the myths, grew and developed. Sometimes the deeds of two or even more heroes were put together to make one story. Sometimes a legend became attached to a myth, so that the actions and qualities of a real person were given to one of the imagined nature gods. So from age to age, the stories grew, myth and legend together, until it became impossible to separate one from the other. All mythologies, we believe, grew up much in this way, and so naturally we find that there are many points in which one resembles another. For example, the Egyptian myth of Osiris and Isis has several incidents which recall the Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone. The reason why the mythologies are not even more alike than they are lies in the differences between the peoples who made them. Each nation made its god in its own likeness, that is, according to its own ideal of what a god should be, and each told the story in its own way. You will see as you read the stories in this book how strikingly the differences in national character are illustrated by them, and you will understand, partly at least, why some of them, and especially the myths of the Greeks and the Romans, have become great immortal classics entering into the life of the whole world, and why others have remained merely interesting stories and are comparatively unknown. Yet all of them are worth reading and remembering. They are stories from the great world fairy book which took hundreds of years to make and hundreds of men and women to make it. Or perhaps we should rather say hundreds of children, for the men and women of those days were really just wonderful children. So that's the author, Amy. A wonderful book indeed.